Born into a respectable family in Washington, D.C. in 1870, Albert Fish's immediate family had a history of mental illness and alcoholism. A few of his relatives had perished in mental institutions. At the age of 5, Fish's father died. His mother was forced to work and was unable to care for him, so Fish was sent to an orphanage. Here, Fish recalls, "I saw so many boys whipped, it took root in my head." Fish became a painter and decorator, eventually marrying for 20 years and fathering 6 children. But when his wife left him for another man, leaving Fish to raise the children alone, he began to dangerously unravel, his madness fueled by a growing interest in cannibalism and religion. Fish began to indulge in raw meat at dinner, often serving it to his children, who would later testify he would do this on nights when the moon was full. Though he was said to never have physically abused his children, he did encourage them and their friends to pound his buttocks with a self-made paddle studded with inch-long nails.
There was a period of his life where he went off to Europe and apparently spent a lot of time in these male brothels. I think he was probably a male prostitute himself and indulged in all kinds of sadomasochistic, homosexual stuff.
In New York City on May 28, 1928, 58-year-old Albert Fish responded to an ad placed in the New York World Classifieds by an 18-year-old boy named Edward Budd. The young boy was seeking employment. Fish, a house painter, deeply religious man, and father of 6, paid a visit to the Budd family at 406 West 15th Street, under the pretense of hiring Edward to work on his farmland upstate. On the day Fish appeared at the Budd residence for the first time, he stood bearing strawberries and pot cheese from a German deli. He appeared to be a kind, gracious man, white-haired, slightly feeble, and even genteel.
Fish is regarded by many aficionados of crime as the scariest and most deranged of all American serial killers. Partly, I think it was because he seemed so benign. At the time of his arrest, he was this old, grandfatherly-looking guy. I mean, seemingly very, very benign and harmless, sort of stoop-shouldered and grizzled. But he was an incredibly demented child murderer, torturer, who had spent really his whole life preying on young children.
Fish could have easily passed for someone's grandfather, but this was not your average grandfather. Edward Budd was thrilled at the prospect of summer employment with the affable old-timer, and Fish quickly earned the trust of Albert and Delia Budd. Once Fish laid eyes on 12-year-old Grace Budd, he had a diabolical change of his ghoulish heart. Enchanted by the small girl, Fish quickly switched gears and promised Edward that he would return in a few days to bring him to the farmhouse. Fish then insisted on taking Grace along to his niece's birthday party later that night. The Budds, reluctant at first, finally decided to allow Grace to go along with Fish. They would never see their daughter alive again. In 1930, Grace Budd's abduction had still gone unsolved. Over time, Fish developed an obsession with writing obscene letters to widows, responding to advertisements in both personal and matrimonial agencies. But he wasn't your average gentleman caller. Fish wasn't interested in dinner and a movie. He asked the women if they would like to beat him or join him in whipping small boys. Fish underwent psychiatric evaluations off and on throughout his lifetime. Doctors would later diagnose Fish as having an abnormal psychopathic personality with a hint of early senility, but he wasn't considered to be insane. It would be 4 more years before the whereabouts of Grace Budd would be discovered. The case was resolved because of one last haunting letter scribed by Fish, but this letter was not intended for a lonely widower. It was sent to Albert and Delia Budd, whom knew a loneliness of a much darker strain. The letter read,
"My dear Mrs. Budd, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have had I wished. She died a virgin.
After dismembering her body, most of which he left behind in a closet, Fish would carry a portion of flesh by train to his house in the city, where he stewed the flesh with onions and carrots, deriving sexual pleasure as he consumed her. Fish's letter from hell was unsigned, but police were able to discern the letter's distinctive stationery. At the time, Fish was living in a rooming house. Police tracked him down and arrested him. Among the materials found in his possession were old newspaper clippings about Fritz Haarmann, the German vampire who killed young men before selling their flesh in the marketplace. An outraged policeman asked Fish about his cannibalization of Grace Budd. "It occurred to me," Fish replied.
Fish's story and Fish himself seemed to be like the flesh and blood incarnation of all of these kinds of fairy tale monsters that you are so fascinated and terrified and titillated by when you're a child. The harm. It's like the witch in Hansel and Gretel or something. The seemingly harmless old person who offers you candy and then turns out to be a cannibal. So there's something very, very fascinating when you see one of these mythic monsters sort of step off the pages of the Grimm brothers and inhabit the real world.
Fish was charged with the murder of Grace Budd. He also confessed to at least 100 other incidents. "I've had children in every state," Fish teased. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair at Sing Sing. On January 16, 1936, Fish ate his last meals. For lunch, he had a T-bone steak. For dinner, he had a roast chicken, but he barely touched it. Later that night, after a 6-year manhunt, the state of New York finally put an end to Fish's unspeakable appetites by executing him in the electric chair. Fish had even been looking forward to his electrocution. "It'll be the supreme thrill, the only one I haven't tried," he exclaimed. But even Fish's execution didn't come off easy.
When he was in jail, he began complaining that he was having this difficulty sitting and so on and so forth. And when the prison physicians came to talk to him about it, he said that one form of pleasure that he got was inserting needles up between his legs into his perineum and leaving them lodged inside his lower body. And of course, nobody believed this was the case, and they x-rayed him, and in fact, they found, when the x-rays were developed, they found there were the 27 needles of varying sizes that were shoved up into his pelvic region. This was just one of many forms of incredibly masochistic behavior that Fish indulged in. He was a masochist and a sadist, a classic case of someone for whom pleasure and pain are completely inseparable.
During the electrocution, all of the metal in his body caused a short circuit during the first shock. It took 2 massive jolts of electricity to kill him. At age 65, Fish was the oldest man ever executed at Sing Sing. So 50 years before America's favorite cinematic carnivore, Hannibal Lecter, there was Albert Fish, house painter, father of 6, and cannibal. In the 1970s, Soviet state authorities would dismiss any idea of serial murderers, and all in the good name of communism. But lurking among them was a man who would become the most prolific serial murderer in modern history. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in the Ukraine during a time of post-war famine. At the age of 5, his mother recounted that prior to his birth, his older brother had wandered too far from home and was later cannibalized by starving villagers.
Chikatilo had what we would call a tough life. But by Soviet standards, there was nothing particularly tough about his life. He saw some terrible things because he lived through the period of the Nazi invasion of Ukraine. He lived in the country that was ruled by Joseph Stalin, in which tens of millions of people were being executed, sent to the Gulag, dying on the way to the Gulag, dying in the Gulag. People were dying by the millions. The Russians lost 27 million people in total in World War II. So it was a place of death and a place of war and a place of terror. But that was true for everyone. It wasn't uniquely true for Chikatilo in any way. Many people would come out in the morning and see dead bodies on the street with the buttocks sliced off because that was the last meaty part of the body, and a little girl on her way to school would see that, and it's a horrifying sight. And every Russian family, if you talk to them long enough, will end up remembering one story or another connected with cannibalism. The neighbor was caught because they found fingers in the soup, or the guy across the street was selling meat patties made out of people. During the siege of Leningrad, it lasted 900 days. They said the most terrifying thing to see coming toward you on the street was a beefy, well-fed man, because any beefy, well-fed man in those days in Leningrad was probably eating human flesh.
Chikatilo's father was a Soviet soldier who was captured by the Nazis during World War II and was placed in a prisoner of war camp. Chikatilo's interest in communism began at an early age, followed by 25 years as a Communist Party member. During his teenage years, Chikatilo didn't have much luck with the ladies, often rejected and experiencing embarrassing episodes of impotence. He became obsessed with masturbation. Chikatilo eventually moved to Russia to seek employment and earned his master's degree in Russian literature. He married and produced 2 children, despite his impotence. After losing interest in having sex with his wife, a few years later, Chikatilo would be charged with complaints of sexual misconduct and was fired from his job as a counselor. This early incident would indicate an interest in young girls and boys, not to mention disembowelment and mutilation, and a year later, he began to feed his ravenous bloodlust.
The initial wounds on his victims would be frequent and shallow, and typically in this area, because at that point, Chikatilo would have had his victim on the ground, and he would be on top of the victim, having immobilized the victim in some way. And those initial wounds would be wounds of establishing dominance, not wounds that were trying to inflict pain or damage.
Chikatilo moved to Rostov, where he worked as a teacher. Here, a monstrous spree of slaughter followed, spanning 12 years, and uncovering at least 53 gruesome murders, mostly young children. Living in Rostov, a port city 500 miles from Moscow, Chikatilo stalked and preyed on children in train and bus stations. Chikatilo had much in common with those he preyed on, as they too were social misfits and victims of rejection. Carrying a black leather medical bag, housing a knife and a rope, Chikatilo would lure his young victims with the promise of a meal or a ride. Taking them into a secluded, heavily forested area, Chikatilo would then make a meal of his own, butchering his victims, removing their eyes, biting off their nipples, severing body parts, and devouring the genitals of many. Chikatilo would disembowel and mutilate his victims to gain a sense of power and control, which in turn further fueled his sexual desire.
He stumbled into murder, and I think his first killing was, in a sense, accidental and logical at the same time. It was accidental because he didn't bring the girl there to kill her. In a certain sense, he was so unconscious from the force of his desire at that point that he didn't realize that he was going to have to kill her. But then, when he was done with her, it was clear that he could not let her. He was sober again. He was satisfied. His lust had been satisfied. His mind had cleared, and he saw that he couldn't let the girl go. Suddenly, he was a thinking being again. And therefore, as often happens in homicides, you got to kill her. That was his only choice, or take the consequences. So that was the key moment in his whole life, and he chose to take a life. And he discovered, in the process of taking a life, that his greatest pleasure was, in fact, in ultimately taking everything from the person. Their dignity, their peace, the inviolability of their body, and then ultimately their life. He was the great taker. And then at some point in that process, he discovered he was not only a child molester, not only a killer, but a cannibal. That came at some point down the line. But in fact, he made those choices and continually remade those choices. Although at a certain point, what's the difference? I mean, it's tough to repent after 44, 44 killings. He even said at the end, this was even more horrifying than nearly anything that he said. He said, and in the end, it was even starting to get a little bit routine, It was kind of dull, the bloom was off. It wasn't like back in the good old days when it was all fresh to me and I was excited, It's hard to get excited about this stuff anymore,
Typically, serial killers escalate their sadism, their torturing. They may start with just strangling a victim, but by the time they get to the 5th victim, they may be, keeping her in a chair for days on end, tying her up, torturing her, electrocuting her, injecting cleaning fluid in her veins to see her convulse, doing all kinds of unspeakable things. And certainly at some point, the level of sadism increases so that cannibalism becomes a viable option. It's kind of like a drug addict who needs larger and larger doses of the same drug in order to maintain that high. Well, serial killers get high on sadism and on torturing, and at some point, they're not satisfied any longer by the level of sadism achieved, and they turn to cannibalism.
In all, Chikatilo cannibalized at least 36 victims. Suspected as a likely subject to the Mad Beast murders, Chikatilo was later released before questioning, as Soviet authorities were informed that Chikatilo was a Communist Party member. Therefore, he could not possibly be a murderer, let alone a serial murderer. The investigating powers eventually turned their attention towards the moral cleansing of homosexuals in Russia, while more and more bodies, mutilated, were discovered, as Chikatilo, the bloodthirsty madman, was still on the loose. Incredibly, authorities released Chikatilo a second time, after a blood and semen test resulted in a negative match for Chikatilo's blood type. Free again, Chikatilo resumed his reign of terror until 2 Soviet investigators posted at a rural train station spotted Chikatilo emerging from the forest and immediately arrested him. At his 1994 trial, Chikatilo told the court how he would boil and eat the nipples and severed testicles of his victims. People in the courtroom fainted.
The odd thing about Chikatilo was, even though he did admit to being a cannibal and eating or biting certain parts off of the body, he would never admit that he was eating the uterus of women. He would admit that he removed the uterus so skillfully, in fact, the police thought it had to be a surgeon for a while and that was doing the killings, and they did background checks on thousands of surgeons, so he was quite skillful at that. And he would also admit that he would take the woman's uterus, which is a small pear-shaped organ as it's traditionally described, and he would nibble it, okay? Because he liked its springiness, he liked its toothsomeness, okay? But eat it? No, I would never do anything of that sort. That was true. He would never admit to eating it, and yet it was clear that he was eating it, at least again by circumstantial evidence, because none was ever found in the vicinity of the crime when bodies were found reasonably fresh. Inspector Kostoyev never quite knew whether that was because even Chikatilo had some shame left in him, or Chikatilo figured, okay, I'm going to admit to everything else, but I'm not going to admit to absolutely everything. I'm going to keep a little power in the situation. Here I can say no, they're not going to do anything to me for this. I'm a lost soul, but here I'll make a little stand. I'll give them a little trouble. I won't go like a sheep to the end.
What I did was not for sexual pleasure. Rather, it brought me some peace of mind, Chikatilo told the court.
A lot of the wounds that Chikatilo inflicted were inflicted on the sexual parts of his victims, and it wasn't by accident. He was taking from them what he felt had been taken from him. In a certain sense, he was seeking justice.
little is known about the effects of eating human flesh. Some studies have revealed tribes ritualistically cannibalizing became struck with kuru, a disease of the brain, later named the laughing disease, causing hysterical laughter and crippling the sufferer with uncontrollable muscle spasms.
It does strange things to the physiology. I mean, Inspector Kustoyev told me, and it's in my book, Hunting the Devil, that there was terrible smells came from Chikatilo. They gradually disappeared. And then a Scottish doctor wrote me a letter explaining how the digestion of human flesh, we're not really set up for it. And it produces something, anyway, some kind of terrible chemical stink that emanates through the pores in the skin of the person in question.
Some studies have proven that in large quantities, human flesh provides significant protein, tasting similar to veal, pork, chicken, or even sirloin. Chikatilo had no preference.
Chikatilo had a disease. I mean, it's the question of, is Chikatilo sick or is he evil? I say he's both, and he's evil because he didn't take responsibility for his sickness. I mean, he knew always, on some level, that you don't just kill little children. I mean, he wasn't a stupid person. He knew, and he was very careful to not get caught, and very successful in not being caught.
Not only did Chikatilo express no remorse for killing his victims, he displayed no emotion for an innocent man convicted and executed for a murder Chikatilo committed in his earlier years.
The urge that moved Chikatilo was clearly a very powerful urge, because it broke through all social taboos. It was a mighty urge. And yet, when Chikatilo felt the cops were on his track, suddenly he had the willpower to desist from those urges, resist those urges for 3 years at a time.
After Chikatilo had been convicted for 53 murders, he was executed.
He was taken from his cell, and traditionally, he would be forced to his knees. Then he would be executed by having a 9mm bullet shot through his brain from under his right ear. Just before they shot him, he screamed out, "Don't blow out my brains, the Japanese want to buy them." And those were Chikatilo's last words. And in fact, the Japanese did want to buy his brains, I believe, or at least there were rumors to the effect that someone from Japan wanted to buy his brains. So his last words were, don't blow out my brains, the Japanese want to buy them."